The computers and their central processing unit chips generate a large amount of heat for their small size, and that heat needs to be removed away, out into the surrounding environment, away from the computer. Normally this is done through the method of heat sinks and fans, but for once I thought I would try something different: water cooling. When we look back at the early days of computers, this one from 1987, an IBM 286, now that didn't need any extra way of getting the heat out of the CPU. It's small enough, there's not many transistors in it doesn't generate too much heat. But later on with the IBM 386, it did need a little heatsink, and then it sort of built up. The passive heat sinks getting bigger and then requiring fans to dissipate the heat even faster. And when we go back to the Raspberry Pis, even the early ones there didn't need any extra ways of getting rid of the heat, but later on they had to radiate the heat away through to the motherboard, give it a bigger surface area to remove the heat away from the device. For most of my computers, I use an aftermarket heatsink, be it whether a passive cooler in the case of my NAS, or something beefier for my main desktop, this one from Be Quiet, but I've also used coolers from Noctua. So I go for normally quite high end. I have gone for lower end as well in the past, and even the lower end ones are actually a big boost over the manufacturer provided. Yeah, I really can't stand the manufacturer provided CPU coolers. They're far too noisy and uncomfortable to have, because as soon as you start running the CPU flat out, you're generating a lot of heat. That heat needs to be removed. The fan is very small, so the fan has to run flat out, which makes a lot of noise. The bigger coolers with the 12 or 14 centimeter fans have a nice big area, and the fans move slower. You can push more air through with a slower speed. Anyway, that brings me on to the latest build. This one using a case from NXZT, the H210, and this was a Mini ITX build. Now technically this case can hold a reasonably large CPU cooler, but I thought for aesthetic reasons that I would take a different route: water cooling. I went with the ASUS ROG Strix LC120. At £97, that is the most expensive cooler I have purchased. So what can I say? Well, first off, fitting it into the NXZT H210 was an absolute pain. Quite a lot of the water-cooled CPUs that I've seen use a dual radiator, so that would require two 120mm fans to be attached. Now in my mind, the way to remove heat away from the radiator would be to push it out of the case, therefore pushing it out of the front. The front is the only place where it has filters on this case, so that would mean I would be ingesting air from one of the other fans that doesn't have filters over it, so that would just end up filling the case with dust. So that's a no-go. So I went with a single radiator, so it could be placed on one of the other fan slots. Now when I say one of the other ones, what I didn't realise was the top one was so close to the memory that mounting the radiator there was actually impossible. So mistake learned there. But fortunately I could place it where the rear fan was. And yeah, at least then the heat can be pushed out of the case. As well as some of the other heat being generated internally, I'm sure that will be pushed out that fan as well, pushed out the radiator and yeah, removed into the external environment. But even then, this was still quite a pain to fit in. It still looks a bit bulky, you've got the tubes. Yeah, this was stuff that I wasn't used to with the air-cooled CPU coolers. But how was it afterwards? What was the performance like? Well, honestly, I'm surprised it only just seemed to hold it together after a sustained period of the CPU running flat out. And honestly, I think if I'd spent £100 on an air cooler, it would have done a lot better than £100 on this all-in-one water cooler. What I suspect is the dual radiator CPU coolers probably have a better performance than you could get out of one of those air-cooled coolers that you stick on the motherboard. Although you can get dual fans, and I've had those in the past. But it was difficult to say really, because a lot of these coolers I was looking at, they didn't actually say the performance on them. How much heat could they actually dissipate away from the CPU? Because let's say if that was 120 watts that could dissipate and the CPU is running at 100 watts, then you've got that 20 watt margin, so you're going to be running fairly high speed if the CPU is actually getting hot after a period of time. But if it was higher, let's say 150 or 200 watts performance, then At worst case, you're going to get about half speed out of it, so that's going to remain very quiet. This single radiator has been like almost on par with what I would have expected out of a decent air-cooled CPU cooler. The dual radiators, yeah, maybe they're better, but in this case I couldn't have held it. It's kind of more about the difficulties with where you're mounting it, really. The limitations of this case, yes, I appreciated that. Aesthetically, I'm not so sure, really. I think it's only kind of marginally better like this. It's different though, that's what I would have to say. I was actually disappointed there was no lighting on this because I was led to believe that there would be. It said about putting a USB cable onto it, so that would go onto the internal USB header on the motherboard, but there was no cable provided in what I had. I don't think I even spotted where it would have gone. So although I've gone with a water-cooled CPU cooler, I can't say I'm in a rush to do it again, unless the build I was looking for required it for aesthetic reasons. My preference still leans towards these high-end air coolers. I mean, I had this Be Quiet Dark Rock Pro back in 2011, and I used it in the computer up until 2017, and it still sounded as good 6 years on as it did when it was brand new. It had a lifetime of 300,000 hours. It's simpler, it had 2 fans on it on this one, but yeah, all it has are the fans. It doesn't have the pump or anything. But do you know what? I'm glad that I've tried water cooling at least once. Well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all later.